Hi, and thanks for viewing my screencast on Smithsonian Wild and in Smithsonian's Encyclopedia of Life. What I want to show you first is Smithsonian Wild. What you can see here is the main page, and you can see previews of different images that they have in the repository. You can see just from these first couple of items that the image quality is not necessarily very high. What's important is which animal species is present, at what time of day, what sort of bait is used, and so on. So there are much more important factors to this than just the quality of the image. These come from 9 different projects across the globe, which we can see on the projects page. One of the key issues with this repository is that metadata standards came from these 9 different projects and had to be crosswalked together in order to make this whole system make sense. So what I can show you really quickly is that, because it's pretty neat. This is the crosswalking process. Basically, all of the different left side elements were entered into a spreadsheet, and then if they were called variations in other projects, that was changed and they were carried over to the new name. You can see here that there are parts of BCI, which is just an abbreviation for one of the projects, but may not be used in SI database, which is the Smithsonian Institute database. So you can see here, basically these are the metadata standards that we wrote on our wiki. They're all here, and it's interesting as you look over this sheet, what is important to these researchers, what kind of camera was used. There's a whole section for what kind of bait was used and what the setup was to lure the animal to the trap. There are different sections for camera settings. Here on image sequence, this is a really important part because what they really wanted to try to do in a lot of these was to create these near movie images where they would get several stills in a row and you can kind of see the animal move across the camera's field of view. And so where an image occurs in the sequence is really important in this metadata schema so that you can see several images that are intended to be grouped together. Oftentimes they mean more as a group than they do as an individual image. So back to the side a little bit. If we go visit one of the projects, we'll get information here. One of the things that made this a little bit difficult was that not a lot of metadata is available to users. You see some information about where the project is, but when you go to the individual images, there really isn't a lot of metadata for them. A lot of it operates in the background without the user knowing. This all comes from the Flickr API, which is their application management system. And you can see as you go through these pictures that you get information such as a title, which is the animal that appears, where the project is, how many pictures, where it is, and the sequence of pictures. But then you're really not getting a whole lot of information about this individual image. That comes in metadata that's not really available to the home user. There's a little paragraph about bears, so every picture that has these kind of bears is going to have the same text. And then there's some project objectives for this specific project. So if we did a search for all of the bear pictures, some may come from Appalachian Trail, some may come from somewhere else, and so we'll get information about what the objectives are of the specific project. So really there's a lot going on under the hood that you don't see here. What made this really fascinating for me was communicating with some of the tech team that had actually put this together and made it work. Because not a lot of it's visible on the surface, I had to go and ask and see what was up. But I'm really glad that I did. It has some neat metadata going on. Because there were so many issues early in the process, early this year they got together and did an idealized metadata schema. This is like their dream team, best case scenario ever metadata. And you can see this looks suspiciously like charts from the textbook early in the semester. And they've described what are the different role types they want, what features, what bait types, what set types, etc., what it is that they want to know for all of these pictures and how those pieces of information relate together. So it's kind of a combination between like a list and a flowchart, and I really love both of those things. So this has been super neat to look at. There are different symbols going on that say which parts, which metadata information is dependent on other parts, and so it really works in a lot more complex way to represent what's going on with this than we did back with the spreadsheet where we just have a list. So this is just a more complicated version of that spreadsheet list. Moving on to Encyclopedia of Life, which is another Smithsonian repository. This is entirely different in that the metadata is a lot more transparent. It's easier to see where things come from. It's created for and by a larger community. The attempt is to bring together information on 1.9 million known species of animals. This is the front page. It's just got some little teasers and then links to information about different announcements and what's new in terms of the project and the way that it's set up. You can also subscribe to the RSS if you're really interested in this project. And let's look at an individual species page to kind of see what we're looking at here. Okay, so this species page isn't actually content that's created by Smithsonian. It's possible that it is, but there's no guarantee. What it does is it pulls information from other sources. So when you go down here, the basic left side elements describing the animal itself are here in this table of contents. From the comprehensive just description, which is, hey, there's these animals, they're marmots, they do some stuff, all the way down to where they fit in terms of the size and how you can identify them, to their behavior, including reproductive behavior, which gets its own little subcategory. And so all of this information that gets pulled together comes from external sources. This one comes from Animal Diversity Web, for instance, and there's offered a link back to where this comes from. So what this project does is not organize original content. What it does is it actually creates engines that go and find information and then bring them back together. As I mentioned in the presentation, one of the goals of this project is to create synthetic knowledge that didn't exist before, and we do that by bringing together content that already exists and using that to inform a new understanding. So the value here really is in bringing together information from other sources. So for each of these, what the project calls data objects, which are these little paragraphs of information, or in the case higher up the page, these images that we've got here, there's information about where it comes from, as well as information about how the animal itself is classified. So really you have three different taxonomies going on here. You've got this one table of contents schema that organizes information about the animal in the picture. You have this small section up here for pictures that describes what is going on with the paragraph or the image. It says where it came from, who owns the rights, etc. But then there's also one more organizing schema, and that is this very traditional taxonomy of organisms. This is very interesting in that when I started looking at this, I had no idea, number one, that there were this many kingdoms now, including Chromista, and then viruses and archaea. So what they've really done is cobbled together many, many different classification schemes. You can see in the pull-down menu that there are about 8. The ant people have come up with their very own ant taxonomy. So if you're looking at ants, maybe you don't want the general one, maybe the ant people came up with one that works a little bit better for them. It's not this static, this is the right way to organize things, this is how they are sort of system that we all learned in high school. So not only do we have to track metadata on what the animal is like, where the information came from, but we also track information about where they fit in this classification of animals, and that changes depending on whose perspective and which of these classifications you're looking at. So that's a really interesting and complicated process that this does. One of the places their content comes from is called Life Desks. This is a Smithsonian project, and what it does is it offers a wiki-like space to different experts to give information about animal species about which they're very knowledgeable. They can provide image galleries, what's called a taxon page, which gives information about the species that come in whatever group they're talking about. If they're talking about rodents, or in this instance it's corvus, which is a specific type of birds. So they're going through and giving information about which species exist, and then ultimately the hope is to have information on each of these species, and this is where stuff is drawn from to go into Encyclopedia of Life. So this content is, metadata is provided by the person who puts this life desk together, and then it can be imported into the Encyclopedia of Life. So it's really interesting how they've kind of crowdsourced a lot of this information. They've relied on other experts to give them the content, and then they just put everything together. One of the other standards that they use is this Global Names Index. So different names of species, if there are any arguments about how things are spelled or so on, goes back to this. They didn't have to create their own thesaurus for names of creatures. They were able to use this. And actually they are considered a recognized name repository for scientific names. So they may at some point be referencing themselves, which is pretty interesting. So going back to review, this Encyclopedia of Life really does do a good job of pulling together many, many different types of images, types of information, and because the metadata is so important here, in order to bring back the information and make it make sense, to make it go together. So the structures that they've put in place have been very exacting and have been refined over time in order to support such a large repository. Unlike with Smithsonian Wilds, the small size allowed for mistakes. It was okay to not get it right the first time because there wasn't so much in the repository that it couldn't be changed a little bit later. So that's the primary difference between these two, and what I really wanted to look at was one that sort of seemed to be in process and what stumbling blocks were found as this went on, and then one that really had its act together and has a good, complicated but solid metadata schema. If you have any questions about these two sites, I encourage you to check them out. EOL in particular has some really good information. A couple of the scholars that have put this together have written papers, and so these can all be found here. They're always looking for content partners, so if you or someone you know is an expert in a certain field, absolutely this would be a great project to work with. So I appreciate your bearing with me tonight, and it's been a great class. Best of luck to all of you guys. Thank you. Good night.